Hello, and welcome, friends. Welcome to another episode of Horn of Africa Conversations. It's another week, and with me, as always, is my good friend, Professor Mohamed Hassan. How are you today, Mohamed? Good morning to you.
Good morning, Comrade Elias. I'm okay.
Good. Is it warming up? How is the weather down there?
It's getting better. It's not so warm, but it's lighter, lighter than...
Okay, that's good to hear.
Encouraging. Spring is approaching.
Good to hear. So today, Mohamed, we will break from our laser focus on our region, the Horn of Africa, and instead try to see the wider global context, the emerging global geopolitical rivalries between the superpowers, so to speak. The rise of China has been there for the past decade, and there is a growing concern from the old superpower, the lone superpower that used to be, but no longer the lone superpower. As Professor Chalmers Johnson once said in a paper 15 years ago, he said, no longer the world's lone superpower. That was 15 years ago, and now things have changed drastically. So we will try to see this global grand chessboard, so to speak, rivalry, and how then does it affect us in the Horn of Africa? Because too often we in the global South only look at our locality, our small locality, our neighborhood, and forget the global context. So by way of introduction, there was yesterday on Democracy Now! A program on this. The U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Secretary of Defense, Austin, had traveled to Japan. And there they made speeches. And so they had a special show on that. And they invited this Professor Vijay Prashad. He's well-known progressive left thinker. He's now, I think, a visiting professor at Chinese University. So let's take a listen by way of introduction, and then we will come to our discussion, if that's okay with you.
That's okay.
All right, let's watch briefly. It's a brief 3-4 minutes, and we will revisit it then.
We begin today's show looking at U.S. China relations. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with their counterparts in Japan today and will next head to South Korea as part of their first overseas trip. The meetings are widely viewed as an attempt by the Biden administration to secure allies in Washington's campaign to counter China's growing power. Blinken spoke earlier today in Japan.
We're united in the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific region, where countries follow the rules, cooperate whenever they can, and resolve their differences peacefully. And in particular, we will push back if necessary when China uses coercion or aggression to get its way.
The Japanese foreign minister also spoke at the joint news conference.
We agreed to oppose China's unilateral bid to change the status quo, including in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and shared concerns about China's Coast Guard laws.
And this is Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, also speaking at the joint news conference.
I know Japan shares our concerns with China's destabilizing actions. And as I have said before, China is a pacing challenge for the Department of Defense.
Last week, President Biden met virtually with the leaders of India, Japan, and Australia in the first meeting of the so-called Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Beijing's accused the Quad of perpetuating a Cold War mentality. On Friday, Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will meet with their Chinese counterparts in Alaska for the first direct talks between Beijing and the Biden administration. Earlier this month, Blinken described China as the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century for the United States.
China is the only country with the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to seriously challenge the stable and open international system, all the rules, values, and relationships that make the world work the way we want it to, because it ultimately serves the interests and reflects the values of the American people.
To talk more about the U.S. China relations, we are joined by Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, author of many books, including The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. His latest book, Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA Coups and Assassinations. He's a senior non-resident fellow at Changyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. His latest article for People's Dispatch is headlined, Biden Continues the U.S. Conflict with China Through the Quad. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Vijay. Well, let's begin right there with that headline. Can you talk about the Biden administration's approach to China, how it compares to Trump, and what you see needs to happen and change?
It's great to be back with you, Amy. The first thing I'd like to say is that there are deep continuities, not only between the Biden approach to China and the Trump approach, but also before that, the Obama approach, because Obama, after all, inaugurated something called the pivot to Asia. I just want to point something out, which is that, you know, when they say that China is a threat, as Antony Blinken said in what I thought was a very sharp and rather bellicose speech, when he says China is a threat, what do they mean? I think here precision is important. They don't mean that China is a military threat to the United States. After all, the Chinese military has the capacity to defend its homeland, but is not in any way threatening the United States. In fact, it's U.S. naval vessels that are sailing very close to the Chinese mainland in so-called freedom of navigation, sorties, right close to Chinese territorial waters. So the Chinese don't have a military threat against the United States at all. What they're talking about has been very closely clarified at this Quad meeting, which is that the United States government understands that China's scientific and technological developments, particularly in robotics, in telecommunications, in green technology, and so on, has far surpassed that of US and European companies. And this is an existential threat as far as the United States is concerned, the US government is concerned, to Silicon Valley. But China doesn't threaten the American citizen, the average American citizen, but Chinese telecommunication companies like HoA and ZTE are perhaps a generation ahead of US telecommunications companies. And rather than compete, in a, as it were, free market with these companies, the United States government is using immense military pressure, diplomatic pressure, and a sort of information war to push China back into its boundaries. It's one thing as far as the US is concerned, Amy, for China to deliver its workers to produce products for US companies. It's quite another when Chinese companies are competing fair and square against US companies. That's the real issue here. It's not human rights. It's not military pressure. It's not what Lloyd Austin, I think, quite gingerly called destabilization. That's not the issue. The main issue here is scientific and technological competition. And China, I'm afraid, as far as Silicon Valley is concerned, is ahead of the United States in that game.
Okay, you've listened to Professor Vijay Prashad. That show, by the way, was 26 minutes long, very insightful, and we will provide the link from that Democracy Now! Show in our description section. But give us a sense of how this rivalry is emerging, the Eurasia context, Russia-China alliance, and of course India as another emerging power, global player, and the U.S. as no longer the lone superpower, but worrying about the rise of China. What do you make of this?
Thank you, Elias. My understanding, I would like to go a little bit back to the history. If we start just from three individuals who have published, Americans who have published books and became bestseller books in the beginning of the 90s and later on 2000 and so on. There were three individuals. One is, both of them are, they passed away, all of them. One is Brzezinski. He had been a security advisor for President Carter, Polish origin. The second one is Fukuyama, Japanese origin American, who have published his book, The End of History. And the third one is Huntington, who published Clash of Civilization. Of course, the debates between these three manifested by their books. The two, they were arguing it to each other, particularly End of History and Clash of Civilization. Professor Fukuyama, he says, the Cold War is over. United States and the West had won. Therefore, it is United States domination in the world, and the empire is affirmed, and it will remain for a very long time. So,
and in the End of History, he was making allusion to Hegel's movement of history. And now that the liberal ideology has won over communism,
indeed.
So history has ended, so to speak.
Yes, so anybody...
triumphalism, huh?
A bit triumphalism, and another also a bit of propaganda, that it is, if you are out of this view, then you are an archaic, you are trying to fight against a difficult wall, which you will never succeed. So it's, in a way, it is also surrender. This is the fate of humanity. You have to surrender. If you are against this, then you will be marginalized, and you will end up in psychiatric hospital because something wrong with your psychological makeup and your brain. As a reaction to this understanding, it was an ideological book. It was an ideological book in a sense that it is all these left and other left Democrats and so on, and communist forces and so on, they have to be demoralized by propaganda, and a historian, a professor, comes and he says, adjust yourself. You will be marginalized, and if you don't adjust, that history will reject you. That's what he wants to do. But the second is the other professor, Huntington, who published The Clash of Civilization. He said, no. There is no end of history there, but there will be a clash. But the clash will be on the basis of culture. And he divides the world into 6 civilizations. Orthodox civilization, the West as it is one civilization, Islam, and so on and so on. And he says that is the most aggressive, the most backward one is the Muslims or the Islam. So Islam will fight, but it will be crushed. So he divides not on the basis of classes. It's not like Fukuyama said the liberal bourgeoisie had won and everybody have to follow it. And he says that there will be a crisis, and the crisis is there, but it will be on the basis of cultures, religions, visions, and so on. And he explains on that. But the most important ideologue, and probably I consider him the cleverest one, and who sees the world, even though from the imperialist point of view, but he analyzes and he goes deep since imperialism emerged. And the concept of imperialism, the sector of imperialism emerges in the last century. He goes very deep, and then he brings a geopolitics. he is understanding, he says, we in the United States, we are not part of Eurasia.
You're talking about Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, and
indeed,
yeah,
a very
the International Crisis Group and what have you, other think tanks.
A clever ideologue. I consider him a clever ideologue from the U.S. imperialist point of view. And
as clever as some would say, as Henry Kissinger is.
Indeed, exactly. Yeah. Second, because of his also, he is an American citizen with a Polish background. And his eye also on Russia. There, this is a Slavic-speaking people he come from. He is also on the senses that very afraid of Russia. Russia-Polish contradiction probably inculcated in his mind as a child, as a Polish. He uses this contradiction, Polish-Russian, or contradiction in history. But he's a clever one. What he says is that the United States have dominated since after the Second World War, the whole Western world with a containment policy and other and so on. And it have also a very big influence in the world by fighting the Soviet Union and its allies. We have succeeded, he said. We rolled back the major enemy. We have succeeded. We have overthrown the communist hegemony according to him. And now, United States that built in the past, United States being an Atlantist country, which means that United States is not part of Europe, but it became an Atlantic country. At the same time, also is a Pacific country with the alliance after the Korean War, Japan, after they defeated Japan, and so on. The two wings, like a plane. Europe is in our hands, and Asia is in our hands. So it's.
We must not forget also that he was the architect of that Afghanistan quagmire, what he considered we will create for the Soviets a Vietnam type of quagmire in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen and so on and so forth, which finally may have contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union.
Indeed. In his vision is that trapping the bear in Afghanistan by sending mosquitoes, he says. The mosquitoes, they are too small against the bear, but it is the more mosquitoes he sends, it will bite it will irritate it, and so on, and finally it will collapse and it will go out of Afghanistan, and so on and so on. So the man is very clever. The other person later on who wrote also...
somehow peripherally related to our part of the world also, Brzezinski was the godfather, so to speak, of Paul Henze, which we in Eritrea, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa are very familiar with.
Indeed, that is true. I think he is the one who brought him up and so on, and taught him, because this Paul Henze also, apart from being Horn of Africa, he considers himself, he is an expert in Turkey and Central Turkish problem in Central Asia, because all these Turkish-speaking republics is give him a chance after what happened in 1990. Anyway, Brzezinski's view is United States, if they want, or United States wants to dominate and control Eurasia, it have to build 4 anchor states. On the basis of these 4 anchor states, they can control Europe, and then gradually they can control the world. Because United States geographically is not an Euro-Asian state. It is in United States, in America.
It is an island between 2 great oceans.
Yes. Very far from Eurasia. When he defines Eurasia, he says Eurasia 80% of humanity lives in Eurasia. Starting from Portugal, you go all Europe, the whole Asia, the Middle East, Japan, China, all Asia, and the Middle East, including Europe, they constitute 80% of humanity. So a huge number, or the biggest number of human population lives in this area. This is one. Second, huge amount of wealth is there. Third, there are dynamic states, some of them even competitor and rich states. At that moment, he speaks about Japan, that they are also stationed there, Japan, Korea, the ASEAN countries, and this and this. So to control all this and to sit on the top of the world, we have to dominate Eurasia.
In a way, his view is a derivative or a continuation of that 19th century geopolitics expert Mackinder doctrine, they call it.
Indeed.
Whoever controls Eurasia controls the world.
Indeed.
Type of thinking, right?
Yes, that's his thinking. But to control Eurasia, first Europe must be controlled. And for Europe, as I have said, he created 4 anchor states. The controlling system must be France, German alliance must be encouraged, Germany, the second, then Poland, the third, and Ukraine, the fourth. If these anchor states that are integrated under the American hegemony, then we have control of Europe and Eastern Europe. He adds a plus point there, he says, we have to expand NATO as much as possible. And he's the one who encouraged, for example, U.S. Missiles to be stationed in Poland, because it is United States had promised Gorbachev when he was there that in no way they will expand NATO and in no way they will bring these strategical missiles closer to the Confederation. But they break that promise and they put that missiles in Poland. So in Poland, in this way, shrinking Russian Federation, the second pillar, and make sure that Russian Federation dismantles. And that policy, you could see the war of Chechnya was ignited, which brought a lot of crisis for Russian Federation. The crisis also in Dagestan and so on. And in his view also, these
then Georgia, then
Georgia later
lately
on,
Ukraine.
Yes, but Ukraine is
essentially encirclement of Russia.
Yes, and later on dismantling Russia, because Russia geographically is a very big country. And he gives also in that process of dismantlement the strengthening of Poland and putting missiles in Poland, organizing also these other states under NATO. So NATO expanded in a faster rate, and it has swallowed most of previous Warsaw Pact countries and those who are allied with the Soviet Union and countries, and they turn against the Soviet Union, like Armenia, Georgia, and so on, Azerbaijan, and so on. Of course, beneath this contradiction, the oil pipelines also started to emerge, that it is the struggle of the resources also is there, that the 5 pipelines and so on. So we have to see also the Syrian conflict from this point of view, that it is to dominate, in a sense, means dominate the national resources, dominate the market, and so on. At the same time, by this Euro-Asia concept of Brzezinski, gradually encircle China. Encircle China by another alliance with the belt called U.S. Japanese belt, because it is Japan until now didn't apologize for what she did on China in the Second World War and so on. But Japan, at that moment, she was the biggest investor in China, so using the comparative advantage. they have love and hate. They like to eat the Chinese bread, but at the same time, they hate the Chinese, and it is part of the alliance with United States. Of course, the ASEAN countries also a big part of it, Korea and all this, and maintain the Korean contradiction between the two. So now, he speaks other elements which little bit concern us. When he speaks about Eurasia, in a sense, and to dominate Eurasia, one of his major, exactly as you mentioned to this scandal when he spoke about geography and so on at that moment, and if you see European expansion, it started by domination of the Indian Ocean. Little Portugal believed at that moment that the world was flat, and if you go by sea, and then suddenly you finish the flat, and then you go deep, you will never come back. But Portugal's strength came, a very small country, probably didn't have even an 1 million population. She expanded and she found a new route through South Africa and so on, and came to the Eastern Africa. They built a very big military base in Mombasa. Then they took Colombo, Sri Lanka, and from there they extended until Asia, and they defeated the Chinese and took Macau from China. So the first
this is Vasco da Gama in 15th century.
Yes. So they are the first to open, because before of that, the Indian Ocean and its 4 rivers, it is considered the Islamic arc, which is the strongest sea marine countries. It was Persia, it was the Ottoman, and even little Oman was playing a very important role in this Indian Ocean. So dominating Indian Ocean means also dominating Eurasia. Indian Ocean is the smallest ocean, which accommodates big part of humanity, with 4 rivers. And these rivers of the Indian Ocean is the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian or Arab Gulf Sea, and the Caspian Sea. So if in this area, which you consider the choke points, which you can control, like the Suez Canal and controlling Egypt, coming down now in Bab el-Mandeb and basing a lot of military bases in Djibouti, we see, and so on. All this is connected to that. That is his understanding. Because United States, neither an Asian power nor an European power, it is very far, and 80% of the population of the world lives in Eurasia. If we wanted to dominate and to sit on the top, this should be our strategy to dominate. Then United States will prevail. That is his ideas. So to make sure to the story...
The Grand Chessboard, the title of his book of 1997,
indeed,
talks at length about this, the importance of this.
Indeed, which is means in this Grand Chessboard understanding of him, by process, Russian Federation must be dismantled. That is the first guarantee. Russia is too big, it has to be dismantled. But Russia itself is a Russian Federation. There are federal states in Russia. So, and Russian-speaking people, of course, dominate the biggest part. And to make sure to divide Russia in 4 or 5 independent states. The Ural must be independent, the center must be independent, even though they speak Russian, and so on and so on. Once we dismantle Russia, then we can turn on China. Here it will come the Uyghur.
So he was against the coming closer and closer and eventual alliance of Russo-Chinese.
Yes. He believed that it is any relationship between China and Russia, it will reverse our concept of dominating Eurasia. Therefore, Russia is important, and then that Russia must be dismantled. If Russia is dismantled, and this is because of his Polish nationalism also, you could see there in his writing, the dismantling of Russia is a necessary step of the U.S. domination Eurasia. And then we can turn to the Chinese and go to...
Of course, that was in 1997, during the Yeltsin years, way before Putin came to power by 2000, I think, right?
Yes. Mm.
And when Putin came to power, things changed.
Things changed
drastically.
Yes, drastically. He passed away as a sad man. He couldn't see what he was thinking that it would be implemented. But what happened is another thinker 15 years later, or in 2005, another professor, a specialist on China, a specialist on Japan. For our viewers, we can also include his document. It is Professor Chalmers Johnson. This is the one who have
the late Professor Chalmers.
The late Chalmers Johnson, who also wrote a lot of books. He is against empire. In fact, he is the most anti-Fukuyama, anti this Huntington of culture. The conflict, it will continue on the basis of culture. He said it is rubbish, it's not true. And then also he demolishes the idea of Brzezinski. He says no. He says that it is United States squandered the best opportunity she had in history. History gave United States, in fact, in a golden plate, a very good thing. He analyzes United States from inside. He says it's a very rich country, very young country. It have a lot of resourceful and so on, but it abused that, and history gave her a very good chance, particularly after the Second World War. And basically in Asia, it is a chance by defeating Japanese imperialism. So United States continued in an arrogant sense and as an imperialist force that it is to dominate. And that domination of her brought her into a crisis of the Korean crisis, which she never succeeded in that. And it is only a settlement, half settlement. Then it went further, he says, the Vietnam War, United States, he says, and he himself, as a young man, he was a soldier who fought against
during the Korea War in
Japan, and later on he became a specialist on China. His first PhD book, it's called "Why the Communists Won," and he was also the CIA National Yearly Reporter writer. He is in fact a very important ideologue and a specialist on China in Japan. But this man, he came one time to Okinawa. Okinawa is an island near to Japan, which have never been part of Japan, but now is included into the American network of domination, and it became a military base. And there the American and the U.S. soldiers abusing the local population and so on. He went to visit, and he went to Okinawa. When he came there was a very big demonstration of the local people against the abuse of Americans. That opened his eyes. This is a CIA man, a very big specialist on Asia. He is an important professor and so on. He published wonderful books a lot. Then that is the eye-opener for him, and he turned against the empire. In his document of 2005, he says, whatever American hegemonies, and those who think that they will dominate the world and China, they are making a very big mistake. And he analyzes in his document, we will attach it, I will advise any viewer of us to follow and to read, as we have put in, that Brzezinski and Professor Chalmers Johnson in 2005, he published with the title,
the title is No Longer the Lone Superpower, Coming to Terms with China.
Yes, and his reasoning is that the growth of China and economically and so on, it will help United States, which he analyzes the comparative advantage theory of David Ricardo. He says there is no need to go to war with China. By trading with China, we are making a lot of money, and so on. And Walmart is making money. He gives example and so on. But surely, he said, these crazy people in the White House, according to him, if they continue and continue with their adventurism, he said, surely United States will be defeated and will be humiliated, and it will be isolated from the world, and they will never succeed. So he says we have to accommodate China, and we have to change our policy of imperialism into cooperation with China, Asia, everybody there, and so on and so on. But the implication for us, you could see this thinking, and now with the Biden coming to power in the United States, and the so-called neoliberalism, which is in United States and in Europe. We see now in what's happening in Ethiopia with the demise of TPLF, all these complaints of the NGOs, the Amnesty Internationals and all, which is a lie of propaganda we see against Prime Minister Abiy. It is a continuation of Eurasia policy. In a way is that it is, we have to control the whole of Africa. Now we come within the Eurasia concept. The whole of Africa, it had always been in the view of the US policymaker. The whole of Africa is a stepping stone on one side to Africa, on the other side is to Middle East. And of course, it's in a very strategical place. And it have a lot of other resources, water, marine resources, name it. This area must be kept poor, dominated, and we have to control this area in a way that to choke our competitors by controlling the Bab el-Mandeb, and above the whole of Africa, when we speak, we have to enlarge it. The whole of Africa, Egypt also is including inside of whole of Africa. By
part of the Nile Basin and the Red Sea.
Nile Basin and the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So when we look the British imperialist understanding and how they dominate, one of the anchor state for them was, or a so-called state, but they colonized it, which they call Egyptian Sudanese colony in Sudan, and until Egypt became a semi-colony and they controlled the Suez Canal, and they have stationed 110,000 British troops in the Suez Canal. We know that after Nasser came to power in 1953, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, 3 countries, 2 European countries, superpowers, Britain and France, and Israel, what the Egyptians, they call it the 3 enemies, the triangular enemies, that they wanted to invade Egypt. By that moment, the United States took an advantage, and it said no, and it sided with Egypt, because to weaken it as our competitor. So this situation also must be included, because it is the Suez Canal which brings through the Red Sea, connects Asia and the Indian Ocean. So to control the Indian Ocean, the very important line here, Brzezinski, he said Eurasia. Another geographer, a young man, Kaplan, he published in the Foreign Affairs on Indian Ocean, which I responded in my book about Indian Ocean. The man is very, very clever.
You're talking about Robert Kaplan.
Robert Kaplan, in his first book on the Indian Ocean, he says, and lives. When we speak about the Indian Ocean, China and India together, they constitute 40% of humanity. When we add the ASEAN countries, including Bangladesh and Middle East and so on, they are about 60% of the world population. When we add Russia and the whole Europe, it is 80% of the world population. So a big part of humanity lives there, and the wealth of the world is there. But it is we, the whole of Africa, we are part of the most important puzzle in this Eurasia game.
Okay, we will expand on that in next week. What are the implications for us in the Horn of Africa? How should we read this this growing tension between the giants, the hegemons, and how do we secure our peace and increase our cooperation amongst ourselves in the Horn of Africa? How do we not fall victim to the growing rivalry? We will go in depth in the next segment. But what I would like you to focus now is to bring to your attention. There's also another thinker from Harvard called Professor Graham Allison. He has written a book, I think, about 4 years ago. It's on the rise of China, and he brings this concept, what is called the Thucydides trap. Essentially, he refers to the Greek historian of the ancient period, Thucydides, talking about the Peloponnesian War of 30 years between the two giants of Greek city-states, one Sparta and its allies, and the other Athens. And he says that Thucydides, in his book on the Peloponnesian War, he says, it was the rise of Athena as a new power that created fear in the old power that was being displaced, Sparta, that led to the bloody and destructive Peloponnesian War. So Professor Graham Allison calls this the Thucydides trap, in which in world history there are moments where one dominant power that has been an empire maybe for decades, maybe centuries, is in decline and a new power is emerging. And he says inevitably there is a clash. And he analyzes from the past 500 years of history, he says, mostly Eurocentric history maybe, but there were 16 instances of such Thucydides trap. In 12 of them, they ended up in war. For the transition from old power to the new power was somewhat smooth. So the question he poses is, will the rise of China and the gradual decline of the United States inevitably lead to war, or can it be managed peacefully, is the troubling question which he raises, and which, in a way, in our introductory section, Professor Vijay Prashad also peripherally alludes to. There is no doubt now, I don't think anybody can argue, that economically speaking, technologically, China is becoming the dominant power. And the power of the United States is declining. Its only power now is military. And militarily, of course, it outspends all its competitors. I mean, the four biggest near it combined their total budget is that of the United States in terms of military spending. So you're still a giant. So in this critical transition period, unipolarity is ended now. It's no longer the lone superpower. I think you and I can agree on that. A multipolar world is emerging. But will this be managed peacefully, or will the rivalry lead to growing conflicts? Or as we saw during the Cold War, their conflict was somehow managed. They never directly fought each other, but the fighting was done in the global south, Africa, Asia, and what have you. So are we in Africa then to expect in this new Cold War that is emerging to become the battleground of such rivalry? I mean, how do you see this? It's a bit troubling, and as you alluded, in the Horn of Africa already, we are witnessing elements of that at play.
Correctly, you explained, Elias. As I have mentioned earlier, is that one of the theoreticians who says that win-win situation is possible is Professor Chalmers. Mm-hmm. He says United States it have to do two things. One, it had abused itself by squandering the wealth she had, and he explains. In 1950, United States was 60% of world production. For every 10 engineers, 6 was American. It is, in fact, without, when you compare the car accidents in the United States before 1950, which the people who died from that, and what you see, and they dominated the world by defeating Nazi Germany and defeating Japan. It is time for the United States. So he says that if they have continued building their own economy and then trade and so on, the United States will never have declined. And United States is not UK. United States is not France, he says. We should not compare it with the European history. We should compare it in another different way. These are ordinary small countries who got by accident a chance and so on, and they developed and they became an imperialist force and colonialist and dominated the world. So the analysis when we speak to the speaker or to the listener from the Horn of Africa, to make very clear, when we say great power, what does it mean in concrete? Or when we compare American and British power, there are three important elements. You could say that this is a power, dominates globally. Great Britain dominated the world is by her naval force, military force. If your naval force dominates the whole oceans and rivers in the world, then you impose your will. Otherwise, you can even refuse your competitor to use the sea or the oceans. So one is that British naval force is the most important. Second is Lloyd Insurance. Lloyd Insurance came because of the British naval force. That it is everybody who is trading must have an insurance by the British company Lloyd. If you refuse, they can even rob your ship in the sea. So Lloyd Insurance is very, very important. Third, very important is London is important because the sterling became a world global money. Therefore,
and the stock exchange, of course.
Yes, these three combined.
And the banks.
Yes, the banks and everything. This was, now it was in the U.S. hand. Britain became an ally of the United States after Second World War.
It declined as an empire after Second World War, and the new power emerged, the United States.
Indeed. It is the decline came because of her competition with Germany. Germany unification later on and so on, which brought twice a war in Europe and the world. Now, the situation is the reverse. The hegemony of United States from 60% of GDP of world of production, now it is almost 17 or 18%. They abused the taxpayer money into wars, and they have entered Vietnam War, Korea War, and this and this. And Japan, which had been defeated by United States, immediately and occupied by U.S. Army. General MacArthur is the one who designed, even wrote the Constitution of Japan. And Japan was totally decimated and was defeated. In 1960, suddenly she became the second biggest economy in the world because of the war of Korea, that it is Japanese companies producing a lot for the war, that they reorganized their industry, and in the war of Vietnam. So United States was spending and her production capacity was declining, what is the reality of domination. Now to come to this situation, China in production became strong, they became very strong, her human resources and educated class increasing. In Europe, when you take almost about 80 to 90,000 Chinese students, they are studying in European universities. Every year in exact science, they don't study like Africans and third world people, other anthropology, sociology, law, and so on. They don't. They only study the hard physics, science, and they go back. None of them also defect from the country. So there is more than 500,000 Chinese students in the best university in the world, in Europe and United States. And this is for the last 2 decades and a half. It's continuing. When I was a student, The first Chinese man who doesn't even speak English, he's always carries with him a dictionary, Yang Mu. He came to study in the Catholic University of Leuven in 1980 an MBA. He was the first, and he was wearing China's Mao Zedong suits. Now it is almost in 40 years, China's face is changed. Now the reaction of the Chinese and their understanding by reading Brzezinski and all others, China was worried in three important places. China was thinking that energy is very important, and that energy is big part of it is in the Middle East. Therefore, Indian Ocean must be peaceful. At the same time, also Persian Sea and the Mediterranean and the Red Sea must be peaceful to trade. So the Chinese, they said, when the tsunami happened in Indonesia, and there was a very big support from United States, and Colin Powell also was going there and so on, used the tsunami situation in Indonesia, that United States built a military base in Aceh in Indonesia. Aceh is one of the mouths of a canal, a very important canal, which crosses to the Chinese Sea. So
the Malacca
Canal. So the Chinese, they said, and if they block 90% of China energy is coming from the Middle East. If United States thinks Malaga Canal is a choke point to choke the Chinese, they developed a counter to that. In order to avoid that choking point or to be choked, they developed also a fueling station in Sri Lanka after the Tamil tigers were defeated. Then they came fueling station in Bangladesh. They expanded. They have a very strong relation now. What we see in the news, Myanmar and so on, old Burma, it is almost $80 billion which is invested in Burma. It is Chinese, and also Burma.
Pipeline from the port to Chinese hinterland.
Indeed. And then the big harbor they built in Pakistan. Pakistan is one of the most important allies of China. The harbor in Gadwar, which is not very far in Balochistan, Pakistani Balochistan, is not very far from Bandar Abbas, another harbor of Iran. And they want to create in the future a pipeline which comes through Bandar Abbas to Gadwar and then straight to China. So they are trying to diversify. The second point of the Chinese that we have to understand, we Africans in the third world, particularly Africans and the Latinos, China had only 7% of her ground is suitable for agriculture. With the growth of the middle class in China, the consumption habit is changing in China. China is everything she needs. So Chinese understanding is to invest a lot in Africa, to have from banana, ananas, meat, all these China needs with the growth of her middle class. And this also frightens China. And China is, of course, is having a very strong economic relation with a lot of countries in Africa and so on and so on. And this also is one of the view of the Chinese, that we will not intervene in internal affairs, but we will do business. And this is the understanding of the Chinese. The third important pillar, China-Russia relationship, is very, very important. They cooperate in a military sense, that it is fighting terrorism, whether it is in Central Asia, whether it is within China or in Russia. They have a cooperation and peace and anti-terrorism between Putin, Russia, and China. That is one. Second, they cooperate also in the security affairs and trade together. That is, Russia is another country which is exporting a very huge gas and oil to the Chinese through the pipeline. Trade is intensifying between Russia and so on. They cooperate in order to block these external forces who are intruders trying to trouble each other. So, and then the pipelines which everybody wanted to build and to bring the oil and so on. So we have to see the Syrian war is part of this Euro-Asia contradiction. The conflict we see in our region, in Yemen, and so on. From that point of view, Weyane must be seen. Weyane was the best puppet for United States and it is backer because it is a minority, controls a very big geographical area, and so on, and it is there in service. These minorities, they have no their own vision, and they will be subsidized, and they will get also oxygen from external forces. But for Chinese and Russians in general, they want to trade in peace, and the other side wants to weaken. To conclude, another point is that the United States also is watching Europe. Europe, when you speak, the main motor of European relation, one have to understand is Germany. That the German economy is the backbone of the euro. So in Germany, you see the German ruling class and politicians are divided into two sharply. When you take the Christian Adenauer and so on, the Christian Democrats, which Merkel she came from, and all this, and Kohl of the past, and these are elements of Atlantis who wanted to continue the alliance with the United States, and at the same time to be negative with the relationship, expand NATO to Eastern Europe with the same thinking of Brzezinski, but at the same time limiting, or if it's possible, creating problem for Russian Federation. The second important group, which is led by Schröder of the ex-SPD or the Social Democrat chairman, who have also developed a relationship with certain German industrialists, which they call that is a German-Russian relation. This element also, they say, Germany, her relationship with Russia is positive and must continue positive. That we can be also independent, that's the reason, from the dollar oil. The dollar oil means is US-dominated oil of the Middle East.
The petrodollar.
The petrodollar and the oil regions that are US-dominated companies. It is by US-dominated, and we, Germany and Europe, we can get our independence by having an access to Russian Federation oil and gas, and they start discussing with Russian business people and so on, even with Putin, that how to build the relationship between Germany and Europe and Russia.
The Nord Stream pipeline, what
Indeed, yes.
That used to pass through Ukraine, but now
yes,
pass into the Black Sea, I suppose. Yeah,
indeed, and the war of which we saw the conflict in Ukraine, the war against Syria and others. The four important countries where these pipelines will pass is one is Syria, another one is Turkey, another one is Ukraine, another one is Georgia. All these areas we see, United States, in order to block any relationship, German-Russian Federation relationship, to block it and to make sure that Germany remains under the hegemony of the United States. So to conclude, the absolute or the policy of this contradiction, Djibouti is an example. And we will discuss this next time, our implication. This contradiction, it is implication in the Horn of Africa, in a greater Horn of Africa, and Africa, whether it is the Red Sea Basin areas and our Horn of Africa, the greater Horn of Africa, which I consider from Egypt until...
of course, to the vision of the new Horn of Africa, that we want an era of peace, greater cooperation, and eventual integration for a bigger market of 250 million people of that region, which will be able to compete in this era of globalization. But this is a good introduction. We have you have done a good job analyzing the global geopolitics of the past 30 years post-Cold War, from the demise of the Soviet Union, 1990-91, up to present, various doctrines, various analysts. One final noteworthy point to make is this new Biden administration, in a way, more or less continues on a Trump administration's anti-China policy. And Trump, in fact, continued Obama's pivot to Asia. So in a sense, there is a continuity of this, this Thucydides trap, fear of China, and it's a very aggressive stance towards China and the China-Russia alliance. So we need to watch that from our part, and from the smaller Horn of Africa. We should have some kind of what the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, once said, a sense of empathy. And he described empathy in the military doctrine is the ability to get into your adversary's head and think like he thinks. Too often we in the smaller regions of the global south, we only think in terms of our small region. We need, I think, some kind of empathy to get on the heads of the global hegemons and think like they think, so that we can look out for our interests and preserve our peace and secure our peace process. Otherwise, we'll continuously be puzzled by moves and counter moves that are being made. To make sense of that, as you've explained, what we are currently witnessing in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and this belligerent hyping up of propaganda war, of manufactured genocide in Tigray, and all kinds of lies. And if you only look at it from that small angle of the region, it won't make sense to you. To make sense of it, you have to get into the head of the global hegemons and how they are thinking, how the rivalry is emerging. How does Africa figure in this growing tension, this Thucydides trap, as we called it? As Professor Allison called it. Unless you do that, you only look at the smaller region, your locality, your small neighborhood, things are not going to make much sense. I think in that regard, the analysis we are trying to provide here on Horn of Africa TV, you will agree with me, is very essential. We need to expand, of course, to look, for example, how do Chinese thinkers think? Tonight, in this discussion, you only cited the Western American analysis and great thinkers, strategists. But what are the Chinese thinkers thinking? What are the Russian, geostrategists thinking? What are the Indians thinking? Unless we have access to this and be able to see the great picture, we will always be at a disadvantage, I think. So we need empathy. In that sense, we need to maybe perhaps love our enemy, not in the Christian doctrine of love your enemy, but to be able to, to have empathy, to get into the head, analyze their thinking, understand where they're coming from, the moves and counter moves, and all kinds of chessboard, intricate geostrategic balances and counterbalances. Unless we do that, we will always be at a disadvantage, I think. What do you think? And I'll give you the final minutes to conclude, and then we'll wrap up.
Elias, you are correct. I will. I was talking to when I was several months ago in Nairobi. I was invited by a clever Kenyan senator in Kenya, and while we are talking, he said, "Mohamed, yesterday morning I had a breakfast with the American ambassador." I said, "What did you talk then? What he's telling you?" He said, "I listened to him about 40 minutes. Everything what he's talking is that Kenya should stop a relationship with China." "And what was your response?" I asked him. He said, "My response, I took my pen. I said, 1963, Kenya got independent. And today we are 2021. In that, and I am here almost 8 years as a senator in the Kenyan parliament, Senate. There is nothing. We didn't even build a shop in Kenya, you Americans. But you are telling us, stop relationship with China. We are trading seriously with China. Not only that, with their cooperation, they build this for a hospital and this and this. Can you give me, I asked him, said to the American ambassador, one single example what we did in Kenya? He couldn't explain to me. Nothing. He only parrot and only speaks in every single China. They will swallow you, frightening people. But people in Africa are not frightened by China. Because more than 50 years our relationship with you, it was negative, it's not a plus. This is the ordinary senator, the ordinary Kenyan, the ordinary maybe Mozambican, and so on and so on. When you look also in Eurasia, particularly United States and Africa and Europe even is the most aggressive in a sense that is the most dependent in Africa resources, the campaign, China will swallow you, take care of it. They tried to create groups of African intellectuals to tell them that you have to take care, China will swallow, it will take over of African continent and this and this. So one have to understand, Africa as a continent is a very big continent. Second, it has the biggest resources from all the continents in the world. 60% of the resources of the world is in Africa. So the Europeans particularly, they don't want Africa even to develop a little bit. They are not. They are interested to exploit the human resources, even reduce their human resources, and to take over the resources in that continent. So I don't expect from the European imperialists that they will develop a win-win situation with it, because they themselves are a parasite on the African continent. And as I have mentioned in the last time, what the late president of France, Jacques Chirac, said, the day Africa stops subsidizing us, we will be in a very serious crisis. I'm appealing to African intelligentsia, and particularly also for Ethiopians, Somalis, Eritreans, or Sudanese, South and North, and Egyptians and so on, intellectuals who are opinion makers and so on, to open their eyes and to see the world as it is, not their own fantasies. The world is shifting. Shifting, as Elias, you have explained it, it could be in a negative sense. And you said that the U.S. professor, he said, 14 times it ended up in a war, and 4 times it ended up in a peaceful way of transition. We don't know which transition it will take, but we have to alarm ourselves to create a unity our own. So in concrete, you see, how is possible that all these lies and propaganda we are watching the last 3 weeks and 4 weeks is sort of a propaganda of destabilization, because in their understanding, Chinese are coming to the Horn of Africa. Therefore, if we cannot control it, let's create a crisis. There are 3 points in the imperial military and political thinking they have always in the history accumulated. If the Arab will say, "Lo ma tanfa' dur," if you cannot help, hurt. I'm not able to dominate Elias, but I want, Elias is getting stronger than me. I make sure that Elias cannot have it easily put a stone in the shoes of Elias, which means create crisis, ethnic conflicts, and so on in that area. That any other force cannot easily have a relationship. This is one of the strategies. The second strategy is the hard one, that it is invade them, create war there, that it is Chinese cannot come or Russians cannot come, create refugees like the Syrian crisis. So 10 million of the population have left, and so on and so on. Let them fight, bring archaic, backward people of the Middle Ages, give them an ideology, and so on. And this, you see, 80,000 terrorists, so-called Islamo terrorists, have entered via Turkey and destroyed Syria. That's another option also. Third, engineer famine if it is possible. Why not? In the book of the British historian, the Victorian Holocaust, in his book, he explains that it is how Britain engineered a Holocaust in China and in India by only taking the grain of the farmers of India and dumping it in the international market. And in that way, that it is to subsidize also the British working class to have a cheaper bread, that in India and in China, they killed through a famine 16 million people. So they can engineer also a famine in our area, that it is that the big part of the population to die. To make history short, that it is, we have to read properly, to understand, first to understand ourselves, our neighbors, our brothers. We have all, everything God gave us to be one. External forces come and divide us. Please let us think in common, with all the contradiction we have. Let us think in common and understand the enemy from far, who study our psychology. He will study through anthropology our culture, try to find our contradictions, study our family system, and so on and so on. And from a distance, with a punitive amount of capital, they wanted to create trouble for us. Please think twice. Come to the Horn of Africa television. That's with us. Let's disseminate a democratic. We are not against anybody, but we are protecting ourselves. And we are trying to raise a consciousness of our youth. And this is my understanding, Comrade Elias.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Mohamed Hassan. We will continue the discussion next week. But this Saturday, we are also having a conference, a virtual conference, to talk about some of these issues, the vision of the new Horn of Africa, the role of youth, the role of media and women, and the solidarity, and so on and so forth. It's going to be from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. European Central Time, March 20, this coming Saturday. And it's going to be broadcast, stream live on Facebook and YouTube. You're all invited to attend, and we'll put it up on our channel. Before we close this session, also like to show the poster for the conference. The theme, as you know, Mohamed, is securing the new Horn of Africa, securing the peace process and expanding cooperation. That's a beautiful theme, isn't it?
Very beautiful.
What we need is to secure the peace process we have achieved 2018, which is growing slowly, and at the same time to expand regional cooperation and economic, eventually leading towards economic integration. So that's our vision here in the Horn of Africa TV. And towards that, we will continue to discuss, to debate, to bring various perspectives, but always zoom in to that new Horn of Africa secure the peace. Thank you very much, dear viewers, and thank you, my good friend and comrade, Mohamed Hassan. Until next time, I'm Elias Amare. Salam.